A woman wakes up alone on a bench in a park, with a note in her hand. What she reads will change her life forever. What dark secret does the Thompson mansion hide? You'll be surprised by this true story of the powerful, but first don't forget to subscribe to the channel for 10 years of good luck. The Thompson mansion loomed imposingly on top of the hill, its glass windows reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. From the outside, it seemed like a haven of luxury and tranquility. However, behind its marble walls and oak doors, a storm was brewing that threatened to destroy the very foundations of the family. Emily Carter, a 25-year-old woman with hazel eyes and a warm smile, walked through the carpeted halls of the mansion. Her steps, though light, echoed in the silence of the evening. She wore the black uniform with a white apron that identified her as part of the service staff, but her bearing and the way she observed every detail of the house revealed an intelligence and curiosity that went beyond her daily responsibilities. As she dusted an antique mahogany dresser, Emily couldn't help but notice the reflection of Richard Thompson in the mirror. The man, about 50 years old, with graying hair and an impeccable suit, was watching her from the doorway with a mixture of disdain and something else. Something that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "Do you need anything?" Richard entered the room, his Italian shoes making a dull sound against the Persian rug. "Just making sure everything is in order, Emily. You know how important it is to Olivia that her jewelry is well cared for." Emily nodded, aware of the importance the lady of the house placed on her jewelry collection. "Of course, sir. I'm always very careful." "I hope so," Richard replied, his voice laden with a veiled threat. "It would be a shame if something disappeared." Before Emily could respond, Sarah, another of the house's employees, appeared at the door. She was a middle-aged woman, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Olivia is looking for you in the study." Richard cast one last penetrating glance at Emily before leaving the room. As soon as he left, Sarah approached the young woman. "Be careful with him, Emily," she warned in a low voice. "He's not what he seems." Emily looked at her colleague curiously. "What do you mean, Sarah?" Sarah seemed about to say something more, but held back. With a nervous glance towards the door, she simply murmured, "Just keep your eyes open." That night, while the Thompson family dined in the main dining room, Emily couldn't get Sarah's words out of her head. From the kitchen, where she was preparing desserts with the chef, she could hear the laughter and conversations of the family. Olivia Thompson, the matriarch, an elegant 60-year-old woman, presided over the table. Her voice, soft but authoritative, rose above the others. "Richard, darling, have you seen my emerald necklace? I can't find it anywhere." There was a moment of silence before Richard's voice responded with studied calm. "Don't worry, honey. I'm sure it will turn up. Perhaps one of the service girls moved it during cleaning." Emily felt her blood run cold. She knew that none of them would touch the jewelry without Mrs. Olivia's express permission. She exchanged a worried look with Sarah, who seemed to have paled at Richard's words. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of tension for Emily. As she served dessert, she noticed how Richard watched her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Olivia, for her part, seemed distracted, repeatedly touching the place on her neck where the emerald necklace usually rested. Late into the night, when the mansion had finally fallen into silence, Emily headed to her small room in the service wing. However, as she passed through the hallway leading to the jewelry room, she noticed that the door was ajar and a faint light filtered through the crack. With her heart beating rapidly, she approached cautiously. What she saw through the opening left her frozen. Richard, with gloves on his hands, was manipulating the safe. Olivia's emerald necklace lay on a nearby table, along with other valuable pieces. Emily held her breath, slowly backing away so as not to be discovered. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears. What was Richard doing? Why did he have his wife's jewelry? As she quietly moved away, Emily bumped into someone. Turning around, she found herself face to face with Sarah, whose eyes were wide with fear. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Sarah whispered, gripping Emily's arm tightly. "For your own good, Emily, forget what you've seen tonight. You don't know what he's capable of." Before Emily could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them quickly separate. Both hurried to their rooms, leaving behind an apparently empty and silent hallway. That night, as she lay in her bed unable to sleep, Emily knew she had witnessed something that would change the course of her days at the Thompson mansion. What she didn't know was how deeply this discovery would affect not only her life, but that of all the inhabitants of that house full of secrets and lies. The next morning, Olivia Thompson's heart-wrenching scream resonated throughout the mansion, marking the beginning of a series of events that would test Emily's loyalty, integrity, and courage like never before. Olivia Thompson's scream shook the mansion to its foundations, waking all its inhabitants from an uneasy sleep. Emily sat up abruptly in her bed, her heart pounding hard in her chest. The events of the previous night came rushing back to her mind in a whirlwind of images: Richard in the jewelry room, the emerald necklace, Sarah's warning. Without wasting time, Emily hurriedly dressed and rushed out into the hallway. Chaos reigned in the mansion. Servants were running back and forth, their faces pale with worry, while Olivia's screams continued to echo from the upper floor. Emily ran up the stairs two at a time, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Upon reaching the master bedroom, she encountered a scene she would never forget. Olivia Thompson, usually so composed and elegant, was on her knees in front of her vanity, her makeup smeared by tears and her hair disheveled. "My jewels. They're all gone," Olivia screamed, holding the empty jewelry box in her trembling hands. Richard was by her side, a hand on his wife's shoulder in a gesture of false comfort. His eyes met Emily's for an instant, and she could see a spark of satisfaction in them that chilled her blood. "Calm down, dear," Richard said in a soft voice. "I'll call the police right away. We'll find the culprit." Emily took a step back, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. She knew what she had seen the night before, but who would believe a simple employee over the word of the respected Richard Thompson? The following hours passed in a frenzy of activity. The police arrived, filling the mansion with the sound of radios and the flash of cameras. Emily watched from the shadows, her mind working at full speed, trying to find a way to reveal the truth without putting herself in danger. It was then that the detective in charge, a middle-aged man named Detective Brooks, began to interrogate the staff. One by one, the employees were called to the library to answer questions. When it was Emily's turn, she felt her stomach churn with nerves. "Miss Carter," Detective Brooks began, his penetrating eyes fixed on her. "Where were you last night between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? Emily took a deep breath, aware that every word she said would be scrutinized. "I was in my room, sir. I retired after finishing my tasks in the kitchen." "Can anyone corroborate that?" Emily hesitated. She knew that telling the truth about what she had seen could be dangerous, but lying would make her a suspect. I saw something last night," she began, but before she could continue, the library door burst open. Richard Thompson entered, his face a mask of indignation. "Detective. I believe we have the culprit." With a dramatic gesture, he pulled a small diamond pendant from his pocket. "I found this in Emily's room." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily felt the floor open up beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't." But her protests were drowned out by Detective Brooks' authoritative voice. "Miss Carter, I'm afraid you'll have to accompany us to the police station for a more thorough interrogation." As Emily was escorted out of the library, her eyes met Sarah's, who was observing the scene from the hallway. The older woman's face was pale, a mixture of fear and guilt in her gaze. In the confusion of the moment, no one noticed how Richard smiled subtly, satisfied that his plan was working perfectly. The next few hours were a whirlwind for Emily. At the police station, she was subjected to intense interrogation. Despite her protests of innocence, the evidence seemed to point against her. The pendant found in her room, the lack of a solid alibi, everything played against her. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Sarah struggled with her conscience. She knew the truth about Richard, knew about his manipulations and threats. But fear paralyzed her. Richard had threatened her family if she ever spoke, and Sarah didn't dare risk the safety of her loved ones. That night, as Emily spent her first night in a cell, Sarah nervously approached Richard's office. She softly knocked on the door, her heart pounding. "Come in," Richard's voice was heard from inside. Sarah entered, closing the door behind her. Richard was sitting behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smile of satisfaction on his face. "Ah, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "What can I do for you?" Sarah took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Mr. Thompson. This isn't right. Emily is innocent and you know it." Richard's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He slowly rose from his chair and rounded the desk, approaching Sarah. "Dear Sarah," he said, his voice now a threatening whisper. "I think you forget our situation. Do I need to remind you what's at stake?" Sarah stepped back, fear evident in her eyes. "No, sir. I'm sorry. I won't say anything." "I hope not," Richard replied, returning to his seat. "Now, go. And remember, Sarah, the eyes and ears of the mansion are mine. One wrong step and your family will pay the consequences. Sarah hurriedly left the office, tears of frustration and helplessness running down her cheeks. In her room, she collapsed on the bed, sobbing silently. The weight of her forced complicity was crushing her, but the fear of Richard's reprisals was even greater. Meanwhile, in her cell, Emily lay awake, her mind working feverishly. She knew she was innocent, but she was also aware that the evidence was against her. She remembered the security video she had seen days ago, showing Richard entering the jewelry room. It was her only hope, but how could she access it from her confinement? As the night progressed, a plan began to form in Emily's mind. It wouldn't be easy, and the risks were enormous, but she was determined to clear her name and expose the truth, no matter the cost. At the Thompson mansion, the tension was palpable. Olivia, still shocked by the theft and Emily's supposed betrayal, had locked herself in her room. Richard, for his part, strutted around the house, sure that his plan had worked perfectly. But what Richard didn't know was that the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. Among the shadows of the mansion, secrets were beginning to stir, threatening to come to light. And in a cell at the local police station, an innocent young woman was plotting the plan that would put an end to his reign of lies and manipulation. The truth, like an underground river, flowed silently, gaining strength with each passing moment. Soon, very soon, it would emerge with a force capable of sweeping away everything in its path, forever changing the fate of all those involved in this drama of deception and betrayal. The dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and orange when Emily opened her eyes, disoriented and confused. The cold of metal against her back startled her, making her aware that she wasn't in her cell, but lying on a wrought iron bench. Around her, a deserted park stretched out, with trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. "Where am I?" she muttered to herself, slowly sitting up. Her head was spinning and her mouth was dry. The events of the previous night were a blur in her memory. As she tried to orient herself, Emily noticed a crumpled paper in her hand. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it and read its contents. The message was brief but terrifying: "Don't do anything stupid. If you say anything, your family will pay the consequences." Panic seized her. How had she gotten here? Who had released her, and why? The answer was clear: Richard. He was the only one with the power and motive to orchestrate something like this. Emily stood up from the bench, her legs still unsteady. She looked around, searching for any clue about her location. The park was small, surrounded by old buildings. In the distance, she could make out the spire of a church that seemed familiar. "I'm in the city center," she realized. Just a few blocks from the Thompson mansion. With her heart racing, Emily began to walk. She needed a plan. She couldn't go back to the mansion, that much was clear. But she couldn't run away either. The note in her hand was a clear threat against her family. As she walked through the streets that were slowly coming to life with the awakening of the city, Emily reviewed her options. She needed evidence to prove her innocence and expose Richard. The security video she had seen was her best bet, but how could she access it now? Her steps unconsciously led her towards her best friend's house, Megan. If there was anyone she could trust at this moment, it was her. Megan worked as a systems technician at a local company, and her experience with computers could be crucial. Emily knocked on the door of Megan's small apartment, praying she would be home. After a few moments that seemed eternal, the door opened, revealing a sleepy and surprised Megan. "Emily. Oh my God. What are you doing here? The news says you escaped from jail." "Megan, please, I need your help," Emily pleaded, quickly entering the apartment. "It's not what it seems. I'm innocent, but someone very powerful is trying to frame me." Over the next hour, Emily told Megan everything: the jewelry theft, what she had seen Richard do, her arrest, and her mysterious awakening in the park. Megan listened attentively, her face changing from disbelief to concern and finally to determination. "I believe you, Emily," Megan said finally. "And we're going to prove it. You say there's a video, right? We need to access that security system." "But how?" Emily asked, desperate. "I can't go near the mansion, and surely Richard has already erased the evidence." Megan smiled, a glint of challenge in her eyes. "Maybe we don't need to physically approach it. If the system is connected to the internet, I could try to access it remotely. It won't be easy, but it's worth a try." While Megan got to work, Emily sat on the couch, physically and emotionally exhausted. Her mind wandered to Sarah and the other employees of the mansion. What would be happening there right now? At the Thompson mansion, chaos reigned. The news of Emily's escape had arrived early in the morning, unleashing a storm of emotions and activity. Olivia Thompson was furious, pacing back and forth in the main living room. How is it possible that she escaped? It's further proof of her guilt. Richard, for his part, maintained an outward calm, although inside he was worried. He hadn't counted on Emily being clever enough to escape. Now, he had to make sure she couldn't access any evidence that would incriminate him. "Darling," he said, addressing Olivia, "we should reinforce the house's security. Who knows if that criminal will try to come back to steal more." Olivia nodded, still agitated. "You're right, Richard. Always so foresight. I'll call the security company right away." As Olivia left the room, Richard remained alone, allowing a smile of satisfaction to cross his face. Everything was going according to plan. Or so he thought. What Richard didn't know was that, at that very moment, Sarah was hidden in the adjacent hallway, having overheard the entire conversation. Guilt was eating her up inside. She knew Emily was innocent, and that she herself had been an unwilling accomplice to Richard in this terrible plan. With trembling hands, Sarah took out her cell phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd use, that of her nephew, a young police officer who had recently graduated from the academy. "Michael? It's your Aunt Sarah. I need your help. It's about the theft case at the Thompson mansion. Not everything is as it seems." Meanwhile, in Megan's apartment, the tension was palpable. Megan worked frenetically on her computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to penetrate the Thompson mansion security system. "I've got it," she suddenly exclaimed, startling Emily. "I've managed to access the system. Now, we need to find that video." Emily approached the screen, her heart pounding. "Look for the night of the theft, around 11 p.m. Megan navigated through the files, searching for the exact moment. Suddenly, Richard's image appeared on the screen, furtively entering the jewelry room. "There it is!" Emily shouted, pointing at the screen. "That's the proof we need." But just when it seemed they finally had the evidence they needed, the screen went black. A message appeared, "Access denied. System locked." "No, no, no," Megan muttered, typing frantically. "They've detected us. They've shut down the system." Emily sank into the chair, defeated. What do we do now? The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of Emily's phone. With shaking hands, she took it out of her pocket. The name on the screen surprised her, it was Sarah. "Sarah?" Emily answered cautiously. "Emily, thank God you answered," Sarah's voice sounded agitated. "Listen to me carefully. I know you're innocent. Richard. He forced me to help him. But I can't continue with this anymore. I've contacted someone who can help us. We need to meet." Emily looked at Megan, who nodded with determination. "All right, Sarah. Tell me where and when." As Emily and Megan prepared for this meeting that could change everything, at the Thompson mansion, Richard received a call that left him pale. "Mr. Thompson," said a voice on the other end of the line. "There's been an unauthorized access attempt to your security system. We've blocked it, but someone was close to obtaining certain compromising files." Richard hung up the phone, his mind working at full speed. He knew the net was closing in. It was time to take drastic measures. What none of them knew was that, at that very moment, a series of events was being set in motion. Events that would lead to a final confrontation where the truth, long hidden, would finally come to light. The final game was about to begin, and no one could predict who would emerge victorious in this battle of deception, loyalty, and redemption. The afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden light when Emily and Megan arrived at the meeting point agreed upon with Sarah. It was a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, discreet enough not to draw attention, but public enough to avoid any attempt at ambush. Emily nervously scanned the place, her heart beating fast. What if this was a trap? What if Richard had discovered Sarah's plan? But her fears dissipated when she saw Sarah sitting at a table in the back, accompanied by a young man Emily didn't recognize. "Emily, Megan," Sarah greeted in a low voice as they approached. "This is my nephew, Michael. He's a police officer and is willing to help us." Michael, a young man of about 25 with keen eyes and an alert posture, nodded seriously. "My aunt has told me everything. If what you say is true, we're dealing with a very serious case of corruption and abuse of power." Over the next hour, the four exchanged information. Emily and Megan told about their failed attempt to access the security system, while Sarah revealed the details of her forced involvement in Richard's plan. "I've been secretly gathering evidence," Sarah confessed, pulling a small USB device from her purse. "Recordings of conversations, copies of compromising documents. It's not much, but it could be a start." Michael examined the contents of the USB on his laptop, his expression becoming more serious with each document he opened. "This is serious," he finally said. "But we need more. Something irrefutable that directly links Richard to the theft." "The video," Emily said, leaning forward. "If we could recover that security video, we'd have all the proof we need." Megan, who had been quiet, reflecting, suddenly spoke. "Maybe there's a way. If Richard blocked remote access, we could still try to access it directly from the mansion." Everyone looked at her, surprised. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked. "An infiltration," Megan replied, her eyes shining with determination. "Someone has to enter the mansion and access the system from inside." The silence that followed was tense, charged with expectation and fear. Finally, Emily spoke. "I'll do it." "No." Sarah and Megan exclaimed in unison. "It's too dangerous," Michael added. "If they catch you." But Emily stood firm. "I know the mansion better than anyone. I know where the main server is and how to move without being detected. Besides, if something goes wrong, I'm already accused anyway." Reluctantly, the group agreed to Emily's plan. Over the next few hours, they outlined a detailed strategy. Michael would use his contacts in the police to obtain information about Richard's movements and the mansion's security. Megan would prepare a device that Emily could use to extract the necessary information from the server. Sarah, for her part, would create a distraction in the mansion to give Emily the opportunity to enter. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, Richard was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The attempt to access his security system had left him paranoid. He knew time was running out. "Olivia," he called to his wife, who entered the study with a worried expression. "What's wrong, dear? You look upset." Richard looked at her, an idea forming in his twisted mind. "I think we should go on a trip. Right now. Far away from all this stress." Olivia looked at him, confused. "But what about the jewels? The investigation?" "Forget about that for now," Richard insisted, taking her hands. "We need time for ourselves. To recover from this trauma." As Olivia, still bewildered, left to make preparations for the trip, Richard turned to the window, his reflection showing a sinister smile. If he could get Olivia out of the mansion, he would have the chance to get rid of all the incriminating evidence before disappearing forever. What Richard didn't know was that his escape plan was about to collide with Emily's plan and her allies. That night, as the full moon rose over the city, Emily prepared for the most important mission of her life. Dressed completely in black, with Megan's device hidden in her pocket and her heart beating with a mixture of fear and determination, she stealthily approached the walls of the Thompson mansion. "I'm in position," she whispered into the small microphone hidden in her collar. Received, Megan's voice responded through the tiny earpiece in her ear. "Sarah is ready for the distraction. Michael has eyes on the main entrance. It's now or never, Emily." Emily took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were filled with iron determination. "I'm going in." With the agility born from years of working in the mansion, Emily scaled the wall and slid through the garden, skillfully avoiding the illuminated areas. Just as she reached the service door, she heard a commotion coming from the front of the mansion. "What's going on?" Olivia's voice shouted, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Emily took advantage of the confusion to slip inside the house. Her heart was beating so hard she feared it would give her away. With quick but silent steps, she headed towards Richard's office, where she knew the main server was located. Meanwhile, at the mansion's entrance, Sarah was masterfully playing her role as a distressed employee. "Mrs. Thompson," she shouted, pointing at Richard's car, which now had all its windows broken. "Someone has vandalized Mr. Thompson's car. It must be that criminal, Emily." Olivia, who had rushed out upon hearing the commotion, looked at the scene in horror. "Richard! Richard, come quickly." Inside the mansion, Emily took advantage of the distraction to slip into Richard's office. With trembling hands, she connected Megan's device to the server and began downloading data. Come on," she murmured, anxiously watching the progress bar on the device's small screen. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Her heart stopped for an instant. "The car doesn't matter now," she heard Richard's voice. "I need to check something in my office before we leave." Emily looked frantically around, searching for a hiding place. The device hadn't finished downloading yet. If she disconnected it now, everything would have been in vain. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. Emily made a desperate decision. She hid behind the thick curtains, praying that Richard wouldn't notice the small device connected to his computer. The door opened. Emily held her breath, her body tense as a violin string. Through a small gap in the curtains, she saw Richard enter the office, his face a mask of worry and calculation. Richard went straight to his desk, muttering to himself. I have to make sure nothing is left. Nothing that could. He stopped short. His eyes had fixed on the small device connected to his computer. For a moment, he seemed not to understand what he was seeing. Then, comprehension dawned on his face, quickly followed by blind fury. Who's here? He roared, spinning around, scanning the room with crazed eyes. Emily knew it was a matter of seconds before he discovered her. Her mind was working at full speed, searching for a way out, a distraction, anything. At that moment, as if fate had heard her silent pleas, Olivia's voice was heard from the hallway. Richard. The police are here. They say they have some questions about the theft. Richard's expression changed from fury to panic in an instant. He looked at the device, then at the door, clearly torn between the need to get rid of the evidence and the need to keep up appearances. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Richard hurriedly left the office, closing the door behind him. Emily waited a few seconds, her heart beating so hard she feared it would burst out of her chest. Then, with quick but cautious movements, she emerged from her hiding place and approached the desk. The device had completed the download. With trembling hands, Emily disconnected the device and put it in her pocket. Now she had to get out of there, and fast. As she slipped towards the door, she heard voices approaching again. This time, she recognized Michael's voice, Sarah's police officer nephew, along with those of Richard and Olivia. As I was saying, Michael was saying, we have new leads on the case. We need to review the mansion's security systems again. Emily froze. Was this part of the plan? Or was Michael improvising to give her more time? Either way, she knew she couldn't stay there. With one last look at the office, she slipped down the hallway in the opposite direction of the voices, praying to find a safe way out. What Emily didn't know was that, while she was escaping with the crucial evidence, a series of events was unfolding at the mansion's entrance. Events that would change the course of this story forever. The fate of everyone involved hung by a thread, and the next few hours would determine who would emerge victorious in this web of deception and betrayal. The tension in the Thompson mansion was palpable. In the main foyer, Richard faced Michael and two other police officers, while Olivia watched the scene with growing anxiety. Mr. Thompson, Michael said firmly, as I was explaining, we've received new information that requires a thorough review of your security systems. Richard, visibly nervous but trying to maintain composure, responded, Officer, we've already fully cooperated with the investigation. I don't see the need for. I'm afraid this is not a request, Mr. Thompson, interrupted one of the other officers. We have a warrant. Richard paled at hearing the word warrant. His mind was working frantically, searching for a way out. Meanwhile, Emily was slipping through the mansion's service corridors, her heart pounding. The device with the evidence weighed in her pocket like lead. Every shadow, every creak made her startle. As she turned a corner, she almost collided with Sarah, who stifled a cry of surprise. Emily. Sarah whispered, quickly recovering. Did you get it? Emily nodded, briefly showing the device. We have to get out of here, now. Sarah looked nervously over her shoulder. The police are at the main entrance. Richard is distracted, but not for long. Follow me, I know a way out through the back garden. The two women moved stealthily through the mansion's corridors, each step bringing them closer to freedom and truth. In the foyer, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Olivia, unable to bear the pressure any longer, burst out. Richard. What's going on? Why does the police need to review our systems again? Richard, caught between his wife's growing suspicion and the relentless presence of the law, began to visibly sweat. Olivia, dear, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Perhaps you should. But Olivia was not willing to be set aside. Years of repressed doubts and suspicions came to the surface. No, Richard. I want to know what's going on. First the theft, then the accusation against Emily, and now this. Something doesn't add up. Michael, seeing the opportunity, intervened. Mrs. Thompson, perhaps you'd be interested to know that we've received information suggesting the theft might have been an inside job. Olivia's eyes widened, moving from Michael to Richard. Inside job? But that would mean. At that moment, a shrill scream resonated from the upper floor. Everyone turned to see one of the maids pointing towards the back garden. There. I saw someone running through the garden. Richard, recognizing his opportunity, shouted, It must be Emily. She's come back to steal more. And before anyone could stop him, he ran off towards the garden. Michael and the other officers immediately followed him, with Olivia not far behind, demanding answers. In the garden, Emily and Sarah were running desperately towards the back gate. They could hear voices and footsteps rapidly approaching. "We're almost there," Sarah panted, pointing to a small door in the garden wall. But just as they were about to reach it, a figure stepped into their path. It was Richard, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You," he roared, pointing at Emily. "Give me back what you've stolen." Emily stepped back, instinctively protecting the pocket where she kept the device. Sarah interposed herself between them. "Enough, Richard," Sarah shouted. "It's over. The truth will come to light." Richard, blinded by desperation, lunged at them. In the ensuing struggle, the device fell to the ground. All three froze for an instant, looking at the small object that contained the key to everything. Suddenly, a voice resonated in the garden: "Freeze! Police!" Michael and the other officers had arrived, closely followed by a panting Olivia. "Richard!" Olivia cried, her voice broken by confusion and pain. "What's going on? What have you done?" Time seemed to stand still. Richard, caught between the evidence on the ground, his wife's accusing gaze, and the police officers, knew his game was over. In a last act of desperation, he tried to grab the device, but Michael was faster. The young officer picked it up and held it high. "Mr. Thompson," Michael said firmly, "you're under arrest for the theft of the jewels and for obstruction of justice." As the officers handcuffed a defeated Richard, Olivia approached Emily and Sarah with trembling steps. I don't understand," she said, tears running down her cheeks. "What's happening?" Emily, feeling a mixture of relief and compassion, took Olivia's hands in hers. "Mrs. Thompson, there's a lot to explain. But the most important thing is that the truth has finally come to light." Sarah added softly, "Olivia, I know it's hard to believe, but Richard. He orchestrated all of this. The theft, the false accusation against Emily. Everything." Olivia staggered, the weight of the revelation falling on her like a ton of bricks. Michael approached, holding the device. "Mrs. Thompson, on this device we have evidence that proves Emily's innocence and your husband's guilt. If you'll accompany us to the police station, we can explain everything in detail." Olivia nodded weakly, her world crumbling around her. As the officers escorted Richard off the property, she turned to Emily and Sarah once more. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you." Emily, despite everything she had suffered, felt a wave of compassion for the woman in front of her. "It's not your fault, Mrs. Thompson. Richard deceived us all." As the group headed towards the mansion's exit, Megan appeared running up the driveway. "Emily," she shouted, hugging her friend. "Are you okay? Did you get it?" Emily nodded, a smile of relief illuminating her face for the first time in days. "Yes, we did it. It's all over." But as the group left the property, none of them noticed the shadowy figure watching them from one of the mansion's upper windows. A figure that had remained in the shadows throughout this time, pulling strings unseen. The true mastermind behind the entire plan smiled to themselves. Richard had been a useful pawn, but expendable. And now, with him out of the way, the real game could begin. As the police and the protagonists of this drama moved away, convinced that the truth had triumphed, they had no idea that they were barely scratching the surface of a much larger and more sinister conspiracy. The Thompson mansion still held many secrets, and the story was far from over. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, while at the central police station, an atmosphere of tension and expectation reigned. In an interrogation room, Richard Thompson, once a respected member of high society, now sat facing a detective, his face a mask of defeat and bitterness. "Mr. Thompson," the detective began, "we have irrefutable evidence of your involvement in the jewelry theft. The security video clearly shows you entering the jewelry room on the night of the theft. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Richard remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. I had no choice." The detective leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean you had no choice?" Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a fear that surprised the detective. "There's someone else. Someone who's above all this. I'm just was a pawn in their game." Meanwhile, in another room at the station, Emily, Sarah, and Megan were giving their statements, detailing the events of the last few days and how they had managed to gather the evidence against Richard. Olivia Thompson, seated in a corner of the room, listened to everything with a mixture of horror and amazement. Each new revelation was like a dagger in her heart, shattering the image she had of her life and marriage. "I can't believe it," Olivia murmured, more to herself than to the others. "All these years. How could I have been so blind?" Emily, noticing Olivia's distress, approached her and put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Thompson, Richard deceived you as much as everyone else. It's not your fault." Olivia looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "But I should have known. I should have noticed something. And the worst part is that I doubted you, Emily. I accused you unjustly." "What matters is that we now know the truth," Sarah intervened. "And together we can overcome this." At that moment, Michael entered the room, his face serious. "We have a problem," he announced. "Richard is making some disturbing statements. He says there's someone else involved, someone who was manipulating him." The news fell like a bomb in the room. Everyone looked at each other, confusion and concern evident on their faces. "Someone else?" Megan asked, frowning. "But who could be above Richard in all this?" Before anyone could answer, Olivia's phone rang. She looked at it in surprise, as if she had forgotten she had it. With trembling hands, she answered the call. "Hello," she said uncertainly. Her face paled as she heard the voice on the other end of the line. "Mom." "What? How did you find out?" Everyone in the room watched Olivia with growing concern as she listened to her mother. When she finally hung up, she seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. "It was my mother," Olivia said, her voice barely audible. "She says she's coming here. That she has something important to confess." Emily and Sarah exchanged looks of astonishment. Olivia's mother, Eleanor Blackwood, was a legendary figure in high society. Known for her business acumen and her influence in the most exclusive circles, she had always maintained a distant but cordial relationship with her daughter and son-in-law. "Your mother?" Sarah asked, confused. "What does she have to do with all this?" Olivia shook her head, equally bewildered. "I don't know. But she sounded different. As if she was carrying a great weight." As the group tried to process this new information, in another part of the city, an elegant limousine made its way through the streets. Inside, Eleanor Blackwood looked out the window with a somber expression. Beside her, a locked briefcase held secrets that were about to change the course of this story once again. Back at the police station, the detective interrogating Richard received an urgent message. As he read it, his face transformed into a mask of shock. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice tense, "I've just received information suggesting you might have been acting under coercion. Is this true?" Richard looked up, a mixture of relief and fear in his eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, it's true. But I can't. I mustn't say more. It's too dangerous." Meanwhile, in the room where Emily and the others were, the tension was palpable. The wait seemed endless. "I don't understand any of this," Megan said, breaking the silence. "First Richard is the villain, and now it turns out there might be someone else involved. What's really going on?" Emily, who had remained silent, processing all the information, finally spoke. "I think we've been seeing only part of the picture all this time. There's something bigger at play here, something that goes beyond the theft of some jewels." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right. But what could be so important that someone would manipulate Richard like this?" Before anyone could respond, the door to the room burst open. In the doorway stood Eleanor Blackwood, her imposing figure framed by the light from the hallway. Despite her age, her presence filled the room with undeniable authority. "Mom," Olivia said, standing up. Eleanor looked at each of those present, her eyes finally resting on her daughter. "Olivia," she said in a grave voice, "it's time you knew the truth. The whole truth." With determined steps, Eleanor entered the room, closing the door behind her. She placed the briefcase she was carrying on the table and looked at everyone present with a mixture of determination and regret. "What I'm about to reveal to you," she began, "will change everything you think you know about the Thompson family, about me, and about the events of the last few days." As Eleanor prepared to make her revelation, in another part of the police station, Richard Thompson was making a decision. With trembling hands, he scribbled a note on a piece of paper and handed it to the detective. "If anything happens to me," he said in a broken voice, "make sure this gets into the right hands." The detective looked at the note curiously, but before he could read it, a heart-wrenching scream echoed through the corridors of the police station. Everyone was on alert. The scream came from the room where Emily, Olivia, and the others were. The truth, it seemed, was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The scream that echoed through the corridors of the police station came from Olivia Thompson. The revelation from her mother, Eleanor Blackwood, had been so shocking that the woman couldn't contain her reaction. "It can't be true," exclaimed Olivia, her face pale and distraught. "Tell me it's a lie, Mom." Eleanor, with an expression of pain and resignation, slowly shook her head. "I'm sorry, my daughter. But it's the truth. A truth I've kept for decades." Emily, Sarah, and Megan observed the scene with a mixture of amazement and confusion. Michael, who had entered the room upon hearing the scream, remained near the door, ready to intervene if necessary. "Mrs. Blackwood," Emily intervened with a soft but firm voice, "I think we all deserve to know what's going on. What do you have to do with the jewelry theft and the false accusation against me?" Eleanor sighed deeply and opened the briefcase she had brought with her. From it, she pulled out a thick stack of documents and an old photograph. "It all began almost 40 years ago," Eleanor started, her voice laden with emotion. "I was an ambitious young woman, newly married to Olivia's father. The Blackwoods were a respectable family, but we didn't have the power or influence I craved." She paused, looking at the old photograph with nostalgia. In it, you could see a young Eleanor next to a handsome and elegant man who wasn't Olivia's father. This man, she continued, pointing to the photo, was Frank Thompson, Richard's father and patriarch of the Thompson family at that time. "We met at a charity gala and we fell in love." Olivia stifled a cry, bringing her hands to her mouth. "Mom, what are you saying?" "Frank and I maintained a secret romance for years," Eleanor confessed. "He was married, as was I, but our connection was undeniable. It was he who introduced me to the world of high-level business, who taught me the intricacies of power and influence." Emily and Sarah exchanged looks of astonishment. The story was taking a turn that neither of them could have imagined. "But that's not all," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Olivia, darling. Frank Thompson was your real father." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Olivia collapsed into a chair, unable to process the news. Emily approached her, offering silent support. "But what does all this have to do with the theft and the current situation?" Megan asked, trying to connect the dots. Eleanor pulled out another document from the briefcase. "Frank left me more than just his love and knowledge. He entrusted me with the existence of a secret chamber in the Thompson mansion, a chamber that contained not only priceless jewels, but also compromising documents about some of the most powerful families in the country." "Wait a moment," Michael interrupted, approaching. "Are you saying there's another chamber besides the jewelry room we all know about?" Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. A chamber whose existence only Frank and I knew about. Or so I thought until recently." "Richard," Sarah murmured, the pieces fitting together in her mind. "He discovered it, didn't he?" "That's right," Eleanor confirmed. "A few months ago, Richard contacted me. He had found some old letters from his father that mentioned the secret chamber. He blackmailed me, threatening to reveal my affair with Frank and Olivia's true paternity if I didn't tell him where the chamber was." Olivia, who had remained silent, processing all the information, finally spoke. "But why the theft? Why frame Emily?" Eleanor lowered her gaze, ashamed. "It was my idea. I thought that if we organized a fake theft, we could remove the contents of the secret chamber without raising suspicions." "Emily. I'm so sorry, dear. You were a convenient scapegoat. I never imagined Richard would take things so far." Emily felt a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, but also a strange sense of relief at finally knowing the truth. "But there's something I don't understand," Emily said. "If you were behind all this, why come to confess now?" Eleanor pulled out one last document from the briefcase. "Because I realized that Richard had his own plans. He didn't just want the contents of the secret chamber, he planned to use the information to blackmail the families involved. When I refused to be part of that, he threatened me. It was then that I realized I had created a monster." At that moment, the door to the room burst open. The detective who had been interrogating Richard entered, his face a mask of concern. "Excuse the interruption," he said, "but we have a situation. Richard Thompson has disappeared from his cell." The news fell like a bomb in the room. Everyone looked at each other, aware that the situation had just become even more complicated. "That's not all," the detective continued, holding a piece of paper. "He left this note before disappearing. It says, 'The truth is in the library. Look behind the portrait of the founder.'" Olivia jumped to her feet. "The portrait of the founder? It's in the main library of the mansion. It's a huge painting of of Richard's great-grandfather." Eleanor paled. "The entrance to the secret chamber. It must be behind that painting." Michael took control of the situation. We need to go to the Thompson mansion right now. If Richard has escaped, he's likely heading there. As the group prepared to leave, Emily couldn't help but feel that they were about to unravel the final mystery. But she also knew that the danger had never been greater. Outside, night had fallen over the city. Somewhere in the shadows, Richard Thompson moved with purpose, determined to reach the mansion before anyone else. The race against time had begun, and everyone's fate hung by a thread. What secrets did the hidden chamber hold? And what consequences would its discovery have for all those involved? As the group rushed towards the Thompson mansion, no one could imagine the final twist this story of deception, betrayal, and redemption was about to take.